If a stranger quietly fixed the rotting barn roof behind your house, night after night, would you dare ask their name? A man with no name, a broken door replaced, a porch light that never went out. But in the end, what he left behind wasn't nails or wood. It was a question that made an entire town fall silent. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that quiet kindness can change a life. And leave a comment. Do you believe in miracles from someone you've never seen? The story begins now. Scarlett Monroe arrived at Wisteria Hollow Ranch in the middle of a misty rain, carrying nothing but a worn-out suitcase and a divorce paper she hadn't signed yet. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. But the way she stood by the broken fence for a long while, as if unsure whether to step in or walk away, said everything she couldn't. 4 months ago, she was the CEO of a luxury furniture brand, living in a 3-story home in Portland, driving a brand new hybrid car to work. But today she wore a stretched out sweater, and her left hand was wrapped in gauze, because she'd moved out on her own, in the middle of the night, just before the court date. She once had everything, except a place that truly felt like hers. Now, all she wanted was to begin again, right here, in the ruins her grandfather had left behind. A lonely ranch, no electricity, no people, no memory that hadn't faded around the edges. When the rusted lock jammed, Scarlett turned the key hard. Her hands stung with pain. Her torn wound hadn't healed. Defeated, she let the key fall to the stone porch, then sank onto the step, the rain tapping steadily around her like the sound of time she no longer controlled. That's when she heard it, a soft click. The front door eased open, slowly. No one inside, only the scent of fresh pine wood, a dry towel hanging neatly on a wooden hook, and a small handwritten note taped to the wall. "You are not alone." Scarlett looked around. No one. She stepped in, letting the door close behind her, letting a part of her past slip away with it. The next morning, just as the rain gave way to silence, Scarlett stepped outside with a cup of cold coffee in hand, following the overgrown path that led behind the ranch. And then, there it was, Alderbrook Barn, once the heart of her family's winters. Now nothing but a tilted frame of memory, wood sagging, boards rotted and broken, the old sliding door sunken into the damp ground. The roof beams hung bare and brittle, threatening to collapse with the next strong gust. Scarlett stood still, gripping her mug tightly, trying to stay composed. But the cold seeped through her sweater. And the emptiness, it pierced right through her chest. She had once pictured restoring this place, replanting the mulberry grove, maybe even turning a corner into a tiny play area for the town's kids like it used to be. But now, not even the first wall was left. She stepped inside. The floor groaned beneath her feet. And then, the first strange thing appeared. A section of the west wall had been replaced with fresh pine wood, still fragrant with sawdust. No way! Scarlett turned around. No one. She knelt down, noticing an old rusted nail halfway driven into a beam. Next to it, a faint handprint smeared across the wood, dusted in ash-colored grime. Like someone had been working here, quietly, silently. No note, no name. But it was clear. Someone was helping her, without ever asking for thanks. And for the first time, Scarlett felt something warm rush down her spine. Not from the wind, but from hope. Her first night at Wisteria Hollow wasn't rainy, but the wind howled through every crack in the walls. Scarlett sat by the fire, her hand resting gently on Thorne's back, the German shepherd she'd rescued from the shelter. He was all she had here, a loyal soul who'd once been abandoned too, just like her. Around midnight, Thorne suddenly shot up, barking sharply, a low growl rumbling from deep in his throat. Scarlett grabbed her flashlight, her heart pounding. She followed him toward the door, slipping past the wooden gate she'd hastily patched up that morning. Beyond the fence, right where the beam of light reached, the grass was trampled flat, into a long, narrow path. Someone had been standing there. Close. Too close. She called out, "Who's there?" No answer. But then, she saw it. A small wooden box left on the old stone ledge, covered with a piece of silver silk. Scarlett opened it. Inside were three things: a single rusty nail, a small folded note, and the card she had left in the barn the night before, now with a new line added, "I'm not great with words, but I know what needs fixing first." Scarlett froze. She had never told anyone about that nail. It was the last one her father hammered in, before he passed. Her throat tightened. There was no doubt now. Whoever this was, they knew her story, and they were quietly clearing the path, so she could stand again. Out in the silence, Thorn stopped barking, but Scarlett's heart didn't. It stirred, for the first time in what felt like forever. The next morning, Scarlett stepped into the backyard, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. And then she stopped. Her heart skipped a beat. A section of the old eastern wall of Alderbrook barn had been replaced. No sound of hammering during the night, no footsteps, no signs of anyone coming or going. But the new wooden planks, they were evenly cut, carefully fastened, and so precise it made her breath catch. She moved closer, laying her hand on the fresh pine surface. Near the bottom edge was a small carving, arched, delicate, exactly the kind of mark her father used to teach her when they worked on the barn years ago. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had looked deeply into her past. She glanced around. The fields were still wild. No footprints, no tire tracks. Only that old nail from yesterday, now replaced with a new one, gleaming, driven into the exact same spot. A cold breeze brushed past her, and then she noticed her wine-colored sweater, the one she swore she'd left draped over the kitchen chair last night, was now hanging neatly on the hook by the barn door. Scarlett dropped to a crouch, her chest fluttering between awe and unease. She remembered, years ago on a bitter winter night, she had ignored the plea of an old carpenter who knocked, asking for shelter. She hadn't found the courage to open the door, and now someone, without a word, was quietly fixing the very pieces she once turned her back on. No blame, no judgment. It wasn't just the barn being rebuilt. It was her. Scarlett wasn't the only one who noticed something unusual. For the next week, the broken scraps of Alderbrook barn began to vanish, one by one. No one ever saw a builder, no sound of saw or hammer. But every morning a new section appeared, restored with such skill and care. It felt like the work of someone who'd spent a lifetime among nails and chisels. At the little cafe down the street, whispers stirred among the folks of Fernridge Cross. They spoke of an old legend, come back to life. The quiet man, a drifter, some said, who wandered through forgotten farms, fixing what was broken, then leaving before anyone could say thank you. Mrs. Eudora, the elderly librarian, claimed she saw him last winter, mending the daycare fence. Never said a word, never left a name, but no one knew why he did it, or even who he really was. Then one evening, Scarlett passed by the barn to check the newly replaced door. She froze. There on the step sat a potted orchid, exactly the kind her mother loved. The kind Scarlett had thrown out during the funeral season, when grief turned her cold. That night she didn't sleep, not from fear, but from something breaking open inside her, softly. Forgiveness. Whoever this man was, this shadow in the quiet, he wasn't just fixing the barn, he was quietly mending her heart. Scarlett brought the orchid inside and set it by the old window frame. She didn't know why. She just felt she needed to keep it, as a quiet reminder that someone still cared, even without a name, without a face. The next morning out in the garden, she spotted Lillian Windsor, the longtime gardener who had spent half her life at Glenhaven. Lillian was pulling weeds near the withering gourd trellis, her expression distant, like her thoughts were rooted somewhere deeper than soil. Scarlett walked over and reached for the bundle of greens in Lillian's hands. "Have you seen anyone strange around here?" Lillian gave a soft chuckle. "You think a barn just fixes itself, sweetheart?" The words were light, almost playful, but the look in her eyes said far more. A pause. Then in a quieter voice, as if afraid the wind might steal it away, Lillian added, "Someone used to come here, back before your father passed. They never asked for anything, just did the work others no longer could." Scarlett froze. Her father, Nathaniel, had been bedridden for months, and around that very time, the back fence had been replaced. No one ever claimed the work. He's come back, Lillian whispered, her eyes drifting toward Alderbrook Barn. Because someone still believes. This place is worth bringing back to life. Scarlett clutched her sleeve. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in this quiet rebuilding, not just of wood and walls, but of fractured memories, slowly being made whole again. After that talk with Lillian, Scarlett began noticing everything. The strange creaks in the night, the fresh mud on the path behind the stables, the scent of newly cut pine wood lingering where broken boards had once been. She hung a small lantern by the barn door, a silent signal. But every morning the flame still burned, another section of the barn had been repaired, and not a single footprint in sight. Scarlett tried waking earlier. She brewed coffee, threw on her coat, and sat by the window in silence, eyes fixed on Alderbrook Barn. But every time, no one ever appeared. Once, she heard hammering, sharp and rhythmic, amid the gentle patter of rain. She rushed out, calling into the night, splashing through puddles, Thorin barking wildly by her side. But by the time she reached the barn, there was only a hammer, resting neatly on the new wooden step. No sign of anyone, just a single plank, freshly mounted with faintly carved words on the back. Don't wait for thanks. She reached out and touched the message, her heart pounding. This wasn't just anonymous kindness. It felt like sorrow, folded into every quiet act, a kind of redemption, a voice that didn't need words. Scarlett broke down in the rain, not from fear, but because, for the first time, she knew what it felt like. To have someone silently take your side, when everyone else had long since walked away. And that man who had never shown his face, she knew he was still out there, carved into every fresh plank of wood he left behind. After that rainy night, Scarlett couldn't sleep. She sat quietly in the old kitchen, staring through the misty window toward the barn. Inside her, something stirred, something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of gratitude, regret, and loneliness. The next morning, she wrote a note, her handwriting tilted slightly, trembling like her heartbeat. Thank you to the one who's breathed life back into this place. I don't know who you are, but I believe you've known pain too. She slipped the card into the barn door frame, as if sending a letter into emptiness. She expected no reply, but in her heart she hoped, just once, he'd know that he was no longer invisible. But 3 days passed. The card remained untouched. No crease, no sign of fingers, almost as if it had been read, with eyes alone, and then simply left behind. On the fourth night, she heard wood tumble. She ran out, nothing, no one. But this time, beside the card, there was a small carving knife, its wooden handle worn and scratched, and tucked into it, a single dried lavender bloom. No message, no name. Scarlett collapsed to her knees. That was no ordinary flower. It was the same kind of lavender that only grew along the hillside, where her ex-husband once planted seeds, before he left for good. She clutched the knife to her chest, tears spilling quietly. Not because the stranger had finally responded, but because he understood, more deeply than anyone else ever had, that sometimes all it takes to save someone is choosing, quietly, to stay. The next morning, as Scarlett opened the door, she froze. The card was gone. It hadn't blown away. It hadn't been carried off by the wind. It had been carefully removed, and for the first time since she arrived at the ranch, Everett Sinclair had left something real behind. On a newly replaced section of the barn wall, faint letters had been carved into the pine, barely noticeable unless you stopped and really looked. You left the light on. I'm just learning how to follow it. Scarlett took a step back. Her hand trembled as if she had just touched something more sacred than words. The man the whole town only knew through perfectly cut boards had finally spoken. But what made her breath catch was knowing he'd carved those words using the very knife he had left for her. The wooden-handled blade now tucked inside her kitchen drawer, kept like a keepsake. That same afternoon, Scarlett stayed out later than usual. She left the barn light on purpose, then waited hidden quietly in the shadows, hoping. At 9 p.m., a man crossed the fence. He didn't enter. He simply paused, placed his hand gently on the wooden door, then turned to leave. One leg dragged slightly. A long scar traced the back of his neck. Just a moment, barely more than a breath, but it was enough. Scarlett understood then. This man had once been a soldier, and he had lost more than anyone could ever truly know. The once ruined Alderbrook barn was changing now, bit by bit, like a person learning how to walk again after a long fall. The rotted beams had been replaced with sturdy oak, still bearing hand-plane marks, not the kind left by a seasoned carpenter, but by someone quietly relearning how to touch the world. Scarlett stood still, eyes on the newly installed barn door, still unpainted. The nails were fresh, but it wasn't the wood that tightened her chest. It was the handkerchief, folded neatly on the latch, worn fabric, faintly smelling of engine oil, just like the one her father used in his final years. She didn't know why it hit so hard. Maybe because in that moment, it no longer felt like anonymous help. It felt like a message, a story still untold. That night, Scarlett brought the handkerchief home. She washed it gently, folded it carefully. At dawn, she returned to the barn and placed it quietly on the railing. Beside it, a cup of coffee, warm, no sugar, no cream. The way someone who's seen too much might drink it. She didn't know if he would return, but she knew, without a doubt. This place was no longer just wood and nails. It was the place where someone, once broken, was slowly building themselves back, in silence. And if anyone had the patience to stay, they just might see a heart, stitching itself whole again. One breath, one scar, one scent of new pine at a time. One autumn morning, with mist still clinging to the birch trees behind the barn, Scarlett froze. There, in the soft hush of daybreak, was a man crouched low before the last door yet to be restored. Everett, no more hammering in the dark, no more fading clues, just him, kneeling on one knee, tightening the hinge with bare hands. He didn't look up. Only when Thorne let out a soft bark in the distance did his hand pause, as if he'd known that today would come. Scarlett said nothing. She simply stood there, sunlight pouring in, slanted through the leaves, watching the man who had once hidden from every eye now appear through the quiet he wore like armor. She stepped closer, softly, then sat beside him. No questions, no demands. "Do you always do this alone?" Her voice was barely louder than the breeze slipping through the wood. Everett looked at the half-hung door and exhaled. "I spent years fixing everything, except the one thing worth keeping." Then from his pocket he pulled a small folded scrap of paper. Scarlett's note, the one she'd thought was lost to the wind behind the rotting timber. Only he had found it, dried it, pressed it flat between pages of a book. "I read it every time I wanted to walk away." And in that moment, for the first time, she didn't see a carpenter, or a mystery, or a ghost from someone else's past. She saw a soul, slowly stitching himself whole again with the fragments the world had long stopped looking for. Everett stood up, brushing the dust from his sleeves, his gaze shifting away, as if her presence made everything too real. He turned to leave, like he had dozens of times before, quietly, without a trace, without a goodbye. But this time Scarlett stopped him, not with words, but with the unwavering steadiness in her eyes. "I don't need to know your name," she said, stepping closer, just enough to hear her own heartbeat. "I just know this place is coming back to life, and it's not because of me." Everett gripped the strap of his worn canvas bag, lips pressing tight like he was swallowing something once fierce inside him. Faith. He looked like he wanted to say something, but then, suddenly, the old porch light flickered on. Even though dusk hadn't fully settled, he startled. She looked up too. "You fixed that?" she asked softly. He nodded slowly. I'm not good at staying, but I know how to make sure someone doesn't feel alone." Scarlett stepped to the final door he had just closed, resting her hand on the new wooden latch. "Then tonight," she whispered, "don't fix anything. Just sit, eat with me, under the light you turned back on." And that was the first time Everett didn't walk away. The first time he stayed, for a reason he didn't need to hide. They sat together beneath the old wooden awning, where the porch light cast just enough warmth to soften the silences neither of them had yet named. Scarlett didn't ask, but Everett began to speak, like someone who, for the first time in years, believed that pain didn't have to be buried forever in the dark. "I used to be a structural engineer," he said, eyes drifting far beyond the horizon. "Built bridges for a living, but never learned how to rebuild myself." A breath caught in his chest. "My wife, my son, they died in a car crash. I was driving. It was raining. Roads were slick. I thought I was just a little tired. But that was the last time I ever heard them laugh." Scarlett clenched her hand, holding back tears. His story didn't just ache. It made her see him differently. Not as a mystery, but as a man who had chosen to survive a sorrow that could have swallowed anyone whole. "After that," he said, voice low, "I stayed at Mossridge Cabin. No one knew. No one came. I made sure of it. But then," he hesitated, "I saw a light at Alderbrook, and I knew someone was still trying." Scarlett looked at him. "Not everyone has the courage to fix what they've lost. But you're doing it. One nail, one board, and every night no one sees." That night she didn't let him leave in silence again, because for the first time, connection wasn't built on what was spoken, but on what they both had endured without ever saying a word. The afternoon before the barn revival gathering, Scarlett carried a small handcrafted card, brown trimmed, printed with wild daisies, and placed it gently on the wooden workbench where Everett often sat repairing tools. She didn't say much, just one line. "If you come, there'll be cinnamon apple pie and a light that never goes out." Everett stood frozen. His eyes, so used to rotting wood and silence, had never faced an invitation wrapped in that much hope. He held the card, turning it over and over in his hands. But just as Scarlett turned to leave, he placed it back on the table. "I think I should go before things start to feel like home again," he said, his voice rough, like wind echoing from deep woods. Scarlett didn't move. She didn't try to change his mind, didn't plead, just nodded gently, as if she understood that some people don't reject gatherings. They only reject the right to belong. As she stepped off the porch, Everett watched her go, his chest tightening. He remembered a night long ago, when out of fear of getting too close, he turned down his son's request. "Dad, will you come to my school play?" And that night was the last time he ever saw his boy alive. Now standing before a new invitation, his hands trembled. But the old fear hadn't loosened its grip. He turned away, took a step, then another, but something inside him stirred, refused to sleep. A small voice rising from the deepest quiet. "This time, will you be brave enough to stay?" That evening, the scent of cinnamon pie and the soft golden light inside the hearthlight table made time feel slower, like the night itself had paused to listen. Lillian Windsor, Scarlett's longtime gardener, older than half her life, sipped her ginger tea, eyes resting on the window. Outside, the wind brushed gently across the stone steps, like the breath of an old memory returning home. She spoke softly to Vincent Monroe, the cafe's owner. "Scarlett has a light in her eyes again. Do you see it?" Vincent paused, looking up from behind the coffee counter. He didn't need to answer. He'd seen it too. For almost a month now, every time Scarlett stopped in for pastries, her voice no longer trembled. Her hands no longer stayed tucked in her pockets, guarding against the cold. She had started telling stories about the barn, about the new wood, about someone who never left a name. Lillian set down her cup, her gaze drifting far beyond the windowpane. "I saw that light once before, when she first married. Then it faded." She hesitated. "And now it's back, and that's what scares me." Vincent said nothing, but Lillian went on. "I'm scared because that light has settled on someone who's never stood in the light before." A moment of silence passed between them, then a quiet smile touched her lips. "But sometimes all it takes is for one person to step out of the shadows, just far enough to light someone else's way. And in doing so, they get seen for the first time too." And that night, in the little hillside cafe, Two old souls bore witness to a quiet kind of miracle, the kind younger hearts often miss in their hurry. That rebirth always begins in the smallest of ways, with a look or a whisper from someone you've never even met. On a drizzly afternoon, Everett stepped into Briar Hill Provisions, a small shop tucked quietly at the edge of the woods. He only meant to pick up a few things, some nails, a new coil of rope, but then he stopped cold. Near the checkout counter, nestled among old business cards and faded tourist postcards, was a handwritten note, pinned delicately to a rough wooden tray with a clothespin. For the one who rebuilt more than timber and stone. The handwriting was slanted, the ink still faintly scented. No signature. He didn't touch it, but in that moment, something stirred inside him. A feeling he hadn't let himself feel in years. Gratitude. Not for the work he'd done, but for being seen. Truly seen. The shopkeeper looked at him but said nothing. Maybe he'd heard the stories. In a town like this, word travels faster than the sun through fog. Everett didn't leave right away. He stood there quietly, staring out through the rain-slicked window. His hand curled tight at his side, and his eyes long dulled by grief, softened in a way they never had, not even after losing his wife and son. Because what touched him then wasn't the thank you itself. It was the quiet truth wrapped inside it. Someone was rebuilding him, piece by unseen piece. From the ruins he hadn't even realized he was still carrying, and for the first time in years he didn't run. He took one step back, and then looked again, for a long, long while. That night, the wind rustled gently through the trees, carrying the scent of baked cinnamon and the sound of laughter from Elmshade Hall, where the barn revival gathering glowed under warm, golden lights. People gathered, toasting, telling stories of new doors and reborn walls, unaware that the man who had made it all possible was standing just beyond the edge of the light. Everett Sinclair paused beneath a red maple tree, only a few dozen steps from the main hall. He didn't look like a guest, worn jacket, muddy boots, but his eyes never left Scarlett. She laughed softly among friends, but every so often, her gaze wandered toward the door, like she was waiting for someone. He nearly stepped forward, but then a little girl ran out, holding a large handmade card. "Thank you to the one who quietly rebuilt this place, and all of us." She handed it to Scarlett. And Scarlett, she didn't cry. She simply placed her hand over her heart and stood in silence for a very long time. Everett froze, and once again, that old fear echoed in his chest. If he walked in, would anyone recognize him? Or would they only see a man who'd lost everything and didn't believe he deserved to get anything back? But then, Scarlett stepped outside. She didn't search. She didn't call. She simply reached up and turned the porch light on. High, bright, steady. And in that moment, Everett understood. She hadn't lit it to guide him in. She had kept it burning, to say, "I never turned it off." Scarlett stood in the center of the gathering, surrounded by laughter and voices. But her eyes, they never left the large window facing the porch. Outside, the porch light she'd turned on before the evening began still glowed. A soft, unwavering gold. Not urgent, not pleading, just waiting. Everett was there, still in that same old coat, his stance slightly tilted, as if not wanting to disturb anyone. But this time, he didn't leave. Scarlett stepped out. They faced each other beneath the porch light, wrapped in night mist and the earthy scent of rain-soaked grass. His voice came soft, almost a whisper. "I didn't come for the barn." A pause. "I came because the light was still on." Scarlett met his gaze, blinking gently, like holding back a single, final tear. "I never turned it off." No explanations, no questions. They simply stood there. A man who had once lost his entire world, and a woman who thought no one would ever stay for hers. Behind them, the music from the party played like a quiet blessing. But under that light, on that porch, two weathered hearts were quietly mending each other. Everett laid his hand on the wooden beam he'd once replaced. Scarlett reached out, resting her fingers on top of his. No promises, no labels. Just something beginning again, right where the light had never gone out. Since that night beneath the light, no one said it out loud. But no one walked away either. Scarlett and Everett, two people once used to fixing things alone, were now slowly learning how to reach into the cracks together. Each morning, Scarlett began making coffee earlier than usual, always placing a second cup on the step by the barn door. And Everett, he no longer vanished after the final nail. He stayed longer, sometimes just to silence a squeaky hinge, sometimes just to hear Scarlett laugh from somewhere nearby. One afternoon, rain came down halfway through their work. Scarlett looked out and saw him pulling a tarp over the unfinished side of the barn, his shirt soaked through. She called out, "You can come inside." He didn't turn, just smiled gently, eyes still fixed on the wall not yet dry. "I couldn't save my home once," he said. "This time, I'm not looking away." It wasn't just a barn anymore. It was where he chose to stay. The walls slowly rose strong again, but stronger still was the way they looked at each other. No promises, no need to define it. Just the quiet trust that somehow they were needed here. And from those nameless, ordinary days, they began to rebuild everything. One nail, one echo of hammer against wood, one late-night story at a time. They didn't need to call it anything, because now neither of them was afraid to call it what it was. Home, early morning. The air was crisp. The sun hadn't fully risen, but its golden hue had already brushed across every new wooden beam. Scarlett and Everett stood side by side, saying nothing. Thorne sat quietly by their feet, eyes fixed ahead, toward the new wooden sign now standing between the white fence rails. Alderbrook Barn, where quiet hands rebuild everything. Scarlett ran a paint-stained hand gently over her arm. Her eyes were red, not from exhaustion, but from memory. What had once felt like a burden had quietly become a miracle. No ribbon cutting, no photographs, just two people who chose to stay when they had every reason to walk away. Everett placed a hand on her shoulder. "You never turned off the light," Scarlett smiled. "And you stopped walking away." A breeze passed through, making the little flag by the fence flutter. And in that moment, neither of them needed to say another word, because they knew what had just been built wasn't a barn, it was trust. If you're listening to this right now, ask yourself, has someone ever stepped into your life quietly like that? No name, no spotlight, but left behind a corner of your soul gently rebuilt? If so, don't hesitate to share that story in the comments. We read every word, truly. And if you believe that quiet kindness can still change everything, hit subscribe so we can keep holding on to moments like these in every story yet to come. Thanks for being here. The light's still on. Maybe it's waiting for you too. Some people walk into our lives not with promises, but with quiet actions. No knocking on the door, no introductions, just walls mended, cracks sealed, the way one soul gently heals another. Scarlett and Everett's story isn't a fairy tale. It's the journey of two people carrying old scars. A woman who had once fallen apart, a man who had lost everything. But instead of disappearing into loneliness, they chose to repair. One hinge at a time, one beam at a time. Each act a small beginning to slowly reopen the doors of their hearts. Alderbrook Barn isn't just a rebuilt stable. It's a symbol of choice. To stay, even when you could leave. To trust, even with no guarantees. To keep going, even when the past still bleeds. And maybe the real lesson is this. Salvation doesn't always come in grand miracles. Sometimes it's a small light that never goes out. A handwritten thank you. Someone who steps in quietly and never leaves. You don't have to fix anyone. Just show up, truly, and stay long enough to begin again with someone from a single broken piece of wood.